Just let that number sink in for a second. That's how many lives were lost in a single earthquake in the winter of 1556. Even today, it's still the deadliest natural disaster ever recorded. What's hard to believe is that it wasn't even the strongest earthquake in history. It measured around magnitude 8. We've seen stronger earthquakes before and after that caused far fewer deaths. So what made this one so different? Why did 1 minute of shaking kill more people than disasters that released far more energy? The answer isn't just about the earthquake itself. It's about where people lived, how they built their homes, and one split-second decision that almost everyone made without thinking. This wasn't simply a story about nature. It became a tragedy shaped by human habits, everyday life, and choices no one realized could be deadly until it was too late. It was the night of the 23rd of January, 1556. Across central China, families were getting ready for Chinese New Year. Homes were stocked with food for the celebration. Lanterns decorated the streets. It felt like any other peaceful winter evening. The temperature had dropped to around 14 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, or about -10 degrees Celsius. Outside, everything was quiet. Inside, families were fast asleep, trying to stay warm through another freezing night. Most people weren't sleeping in wooden houses or stone buildings. They lived in yaodong, cave homes carved directly into the thick yellow cliffs of the Loess Plateau. These homes had been used for generations. They stayed warm in the winter, cool in the summer, and cost very little to build. To the people living there, they weren't unusual. They were simply home. No one had any reason to believe that would change. There were no warning sirens, no emergency alerts, no scientific instruments telling people what was coming. Life felt completely normal, just like it had the night before. Then, just after midnight, everything changed. The ground suddenly began to move. Within seconds, peaceful villages were thrown into chaos. Families who had gone to bed, expecting another ordinary morning, would never wake up. Entire hillsides started collapsing. Homes that had protected generations became deadly traps almost instantly. People didn't even have time to understand what was happening. In less than a minute, history changed forever. By sunrise, entire communities had disappeared. Some villages were so completely destroyed that rescuers couldn't even tell where one town ended and another began. For the people who survived, that terrifying night wasn't the end of the disaster. It was only the beginning. The shaking lasted for about 60 seconds, a full minute. That doesn't sound very long until you imagine the ground beneath you refusing to stay still. Every second felt longer than the last. By the time it stopped, the world people had known was gone. The earthquake ripped open a fault, stretching nearly 70 miles across the land. It wasn't just one town or one valley that was hit. The damage spread farther than anyone could understand at the time. In total, 97 counties were devastated. 10 provinces felt the impact at the same time. The shaking reached places hundreds of miles away. Even Beijing and Shanghai recorded damage from the event. That tells you just how massive it really was. But the numbers only tell part of the story. Imagine waking up in the middle of the night to your walls cracking apart, the ground rolling under your feet, roof tiles crashing down, people screaming from every direction. No electricity, no phones, no way to know what was happening beyond the next street. For many families, there wasn't even time to react. Entire hillsides collapsed without warning. Villages that had stood for generations disappeared in less than a minute. Roads vanished. Rivers changed course. Deep cracks split the earth open, and in some places, water burst out of the ground as if the land itself had exploded. When daylight finally came, survivors looked around and couldn't recognize where they were. Some towns had been erased so completely that rescue teams arriving later couldn't tell where one village ended and another began. Landmarks were gone. Homes were gone. In many places, the people were gone too. The earthquake itself lasted only a minute. The silence that followed was almost harder to bear. It wasn't the quiet after everything was over. It was the quiet of people waiting for loved ones to answer and hearing nothing back. That single minute changed the lives of millions. And for countless families, it marked the last ordinary moment they would ever have. Here's the part that surprised me the most. The earthquake wasn't actually the biggest killer. The real danger was the homes people were living in. Back then, millions of people across northern China lived in Yaodong. These were cave homes, carved straight into the thick cliffs of the Loess Plateau. For centuries, they made perfect sense. They stayed warm during freezing winters, cool through the summer, and didn't require expensive building materials. Families had lived in them for generations, so no one questioned whether they were safe. Until that night, the problem wasn't the caves themselves, it was the ground around them. The Loess Plateau is made of a fine, dusty soil called loess. Most of the time, it's incredibly stable. You can dig into it, build inside it, and it can stand for hundreds of years. But once a powerful earthquake hits, everything changes. The soil loses its strength almost instantly. It doesn't crack like concrete. It doesn't break apart like bricks. It starts to flow. Imagine building your home inside what feels like a solid hillside, only to have that entire hillside suddenly collapse around you. That's exactly what happened. For families sleeping deep inside those caves, there was almost no chance to escape. Many were resting on heated brick beds built at the back of the cave, the warmest place during the winter. Ironically, that also put them the farthest from the entrance. By the time they realized something was wrong, tons of earth were already coming down. Some people had less than 15 seconds. Not enough time to think, not enough time to run. In many places, the cave didn't slowly fall apart. The whole hillside simply gave way. Walls disappeared. The ceiling became the floor. Entire families were buried where they slept. That's why this disaster became so deadly. It wasn't because the earthquake was stronger than every other earthquake in history. It was because millions of people happened to be living inside hills that turned into giant landslides the moment the ground started shaking. One decision made centuries earlier to build homes inside the Loess cliffs, because they were practical and comfortable, became a deadly weakness in less than a minute. Sometimes, nature isn't what catches us off guard. It's the ordinary things we trust every single day. To really understand this disaster, you have to understand why people chose to live in Yaodong in the first place. Honestly, it wasn't a bad idea. For hundreds of years, these cave homes were one of the smartest ways to live in northern China. They were carved directly into the thick Loess hills, so families didn't need much wood or stone to build them. That made them affordable, especially for ordinary farmers. They were also incredibly comfortable. In the winter, when temperatures dropped well below freezing, the thick earth kept the inside warm. In the summer, when the heat became unbearable, those same walls stayed cool. Long before modern heating or air conditioning existed, these homes naturally did both. That's why generation after generation kept building them. People were born there. They raised families there. Grandparents, parents, and children often lived in the same hillside for decades. To them, these weren't caves. They were simply home. No one looked at those cliffs and thought they were dangerous. They looked safe, strong, reliable. And that's exactly what made the tragedy so heartbreaking. The danger wasn't obvious until the earthquake began. The moment the ground started shaking, the Loess hills lost their strength. Instead of holding together, the earth began to crumble. Entire sections of the hillside collapsed almost at once. The caves didn't slowly crack apart. They disappeared. 1 second, a family was asleep inside a warm home. The next, thousands of tons of earth buried everything. There was no warning, no time to escape. For many people, the entrance was blocked before they even reached it. What had protected families through countless winters suddenly became the place they couldn't escape. Whole hillsides turned into enormous mass graves in less than a minute. That's the part that still stays with me. These people didn't make reckless choices. They weren't ignoring danger. They were living in homes that had worked for generations. Based on everything they knew, they had every reason to believe those homes would keep protecting them. But nature doesn't always care about what has worked in the past. Sometimes the place that has kept you safe your entire life can become the most dangerous place in a single moment. And in 1556, that's exactly what happened to hundreds of thousands of families. Most people think the worst part of an earthquake is the shaking. In this case, that wasn't true. The shaking lasted about a minute. The real disaster lasted 4 years. When the ground finally stopped moving, entire food storage buildings had already been buried under tons of earth. Crops that were supposed to feed families through the winter disappeared overnight. What little food survived couldn't be moved because roads were destroyed and communication had completely broken down. Then, another problem hit. The earthquake shattered the irrigation canals that had supplied water to the Wei River Valley for centuries. Without those canals, farmers couldn't plant the next crop. Even people who survived the earthquake suddenly had no way to grow food. Before long, hunger spread everywhere. Families who had escaped the collapsing hills now faced another fight, simply finding something to eat. People shared whatever they had left, but it wasn't enough. As winter dragged on, starvation became just as deadly as the earthquake itself. Then came disease. When the weather warmed, bodies remained trapped beneath the rubble. Dirty water collected across the valley. With almost no sanitation and very little medical care, disease spread quickly through the surviving communities. Dysentery, plague, and other deadly illnesses claimed thousands more lives. And it still wasn't over. With their homes gone, their farmland destroyed, and no food left, hundreds of thousands of people made the painful decision to leave everything behind. Entire families packed what little they could carry and walked toward other provinces, hoping to find a place to survive. Many never made it. Some died on the road from hunger, others from sickness or exhaustion. Many simply disappeared from the official records, leaving no trace of what happened to them. That's what makes this tragedy so different from almost every other earthquake in history. The initial shaking killed an enormous number of people, but most of the victims, about 730,000 of them, died after the earthquake was over. Not because the ground was still moving, because their world had stopped working. The food was gone. The water systems were broken. Disease was spreading, and an entire region had lost the ability to take care of the people who were still alive. Sometimes a disaster isn't measured by the moment it begins. It's measured by how long people keep suffering after everyone else thinks it's over. For centuries, people knew what had happened. They just didn't know exactly why. Survivors described the ground splitting open. They talked about rivers changing direction, boiling water bursting out of the earth, and entire mountainsides collapsing. Those stories were passed down for generations, but no one could explain the science behind them. Then, in 2020, researchers finally connected the pieces. Using high-resolution satellite mapping and modern geological surveys, scientists identified the exact fault that caused the disaster. It stretched for more than 70 miles, and in some places, the ground had been pushed more than 20 feet out of place. After nearly 460 years, they could finally see the scar the earthquake had left behind. And suddenly, those old survivor accounts made perfect sense. The reports of boiling water weren't myths. The earthquake had violently shifted underground water, forcing it to the surface. The stories about rivers changing direction weren't exaggerations either. Parts of the valley had dropped, while others were lifted, changing the landscape almost overnight. Water simply followed its new path. Even the claims that mountains had moved turned out to be true. Entire hillsides had collapsed, and huge sections of land had shifted to completely different elevations. To the people who lived through it, it looked like the mountains themselves had moved. What amazes me most is that the evidence never disappeared. It was there the whole time. The fault line stayed hidden in the landscape, quietly waiting for someone with the right technology to recognize it. For hundreds of years, people walked across it without knowing they were standing on the very place that changed history. The study also revealed something else that's hard to ignore. This fault isn't dead. It's considered a low-frequency fault, meaning it can stay quiet for thousands of years before producing another major earthquake. But quiet doesn't mean inactive. The Earth's crust is still moving, little by little, year after year. Stress continues to build beneath the surface, even when nothing seems to be happening. That's a reminder worth remembering. Nature doesn't erase its history. Sometimes it hides it. And when science finally catches up, we realize the people who witnessed the disaster weren't telling legends. They were describing exactly what they saw. Out of all the stories from this disaster, this is probably the one that stayed with me the most. A young scholar named Chin Keita survived the earthquake. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't an engineer. He had no way to explain earthquakes or measure ground motion. But he had something just as valuable: he paid attention. In the days and months after the disaster, he carefully wrote down everything he had seen. He recorded what happened to the buildings, the land, and the people around him. More importantly, he noticed something that most others didn't. Many of the people who died had tried to run outside as soon as the shaking started. It felt like the natural thing to do. Honestly, I think most of us would probably react the same way, but during this earthquake, that instinct turned out to be deadly. So Qin Keita ended his account with a simple piece of advice: don't run outside. Instead, stay where you are, crouch down, and wait. His exact words were different, but the message couldn't have been clearer. He believed that even if part of a building collapsed, some spaces inside could still protect people. Running during the strongest shaking often put them directly in the path of falling walls, roof tiles, and collapsing entrances. What amazes me is what happened centuries later. Modern earthquake engineers reached the exact same conclusion. Today, emergency agencies around the world teach one simple rule: drop, cover, hold on. Those 3 words are now standard earthquake safety advice in places like California, Japan, New Zealand, Chile, and many other earthquake-prone regions. The science is modern. The technology is modern, but the lesson isn't. A man who lived through one terrible night in 1556 figured it out simply by watching what happened around him. That's incredible when you think about it. Sometimes history doesn't leave us with complicated answers. Sometimes it leaves us with one simple idea that keeps proving itself, generation after generation. Qin Keita didn't know his words would survive for nearly 5 centuries. He was just trying to help the next person stay alive. And somehow, his advice is still doing exactly that today. You might think this story ended back in 1556. It didn't. The place where all of this happened is now home to about 13 million people. Modern Xi'an is a busy city filled with highways, subways, factories, and high-rise buildings. On the surface, it looks nothing like the world Qin Keita knew. But underneath, the ground is the same. The same fault system is still there. The same geology is still there. And the same forces that caused the deadliest earthquake in history are still slowly at work. What's even more surprising is that 30 to 40 million people across central China still live in Yaodong homes today. Many of these cave homes have been reinforced with modern engineering and are much safer than they were centuries ago. Others, especially older ones, haven't been upgraded to the same standards. That difference could matter when the ground starts shaking again. Scientists have another important piece of the puzzle now. Using satellites, they can actually measure how the Earth's crust is moving. The fault isn't producing earthquakes every day, but it hasn't stopped moving either. Year after year, stress continues to build deep underground. No one knows exactly when that stress will finally be released. It could be hundreds of years from now. It could be much sooner. That's the reality of living near an active fault. We can measure it. We can study it. We can prepare for it. But we can't predict the exact day it will happen. And maybe that's the biggest lesson this story leaves behind. People in 1556 believed their homes had protected their families for generations, so they assumed they always would. They weren't careless. They simply believed tomorrow would be like yesterday. That's something every generation has to be careful about. Time has a way of making us feel safe. We start thinking that because nothing has happened in our lifetime, nothing ever will. History tells a different story. The Earth doesn't follow our calendars. It doesn't care how many years have passed since the last disaster. It moves on its own schedule. That's why the real lesson from 1556 isn't about fear. It's about remembering. Remembering that nature never stopped working beneath our feet. Remembering that preparation matters, even during the quiet years. And remembering that sometimes the most valuable warning isn't a prediction of the next earthquake. It's the story of the last one. It's been 470 years since that winter night. The world has changed in ways the people of 1556 could never have imagined. We have satellites watching the Earth from space. We have seismic sensors, powerful computers, and engineers who understand earthquakes better than ever before. But one thing hasn't changed. The Earth still moves the same way it always has. Fault lines don't care what year it is. They don't follow our schedules, our technology, or our plans. They release energy when they're ready, not when we're prepared. That's why the biggest lesson from this story isn't about predicting the next earthquake. The truth is, no one can tell you the exact day or hour the ground will shake. What we can do is remember what history has already taught us. Nearly 5 centuries ago, one survivor watched his world fall apart. Instead of giving up, he wrote down what he had learned so the next generation might have a better chance to survive. His words have outlived kingdoms, dynasties, and even the science that eventually proved him right. To me, that's the real legacy of this disaster. Not the number of people who died, not even the scale of the destruction. It's the simple idea that knowledge passed from one generation to the next can save lives. Because when disaster comes, you rarely have hours to think. Sometimes you don't even have 5 minutes. Sometimes all you get is 1 minute. And 1 minute of preparation can make the difference between becoming another tragedy or becoming another survivor.